Medabots, Rokusho version. This is a video that has been a long time coming because I love this game. See, Medabots was an anime that we got to watch back in the early 2000s, late 90s, back when dubs were still kind of shaky. But man, did I love it. I watched it with my brother a lot, and it was a great show, despite a lot of weirdness. And because this was a time where animes actually got games, it actually got games. It had 3, in fact, but there was actually quite a few weird things involved with them. First and foremost, it didn't actually get 3 games. If we're only counting the numbered ones and no spin-offs or anything, we're at like 11 and counting. Yeah, they're still making these things. The second weird thing about these games, of the 3 that we got, only one of them was actually Medabots. Yeah, the series was a long-time RPG series, and yet of the 3 we got, only one was that. Another was a weird third-person shooty thing on the GameCube, and the other a weird 2D fighting thing. And finally, and arguably weirdest of all, Medabots, as in the game that we got, as well as the anime that it was based upon, those themselves weren't even Medabots. Those were actually Medabots 2. And I mean, if you're going to count the later series of the anime 3 and 4 a little bit. Yeah, for some reason they decided that the anime would be based around the second game in the series, which is already very confusing because, at least relative to the time it came out in North America, they were already on like the 4th game in the series. And for bonus weirdness around these games and the anime, it actually wasn't games based on anime at all. It was anime based on games. That actually didn't happen all that much, especially back then. So if we're going to talk about Medabots properly, I think we have to start at the beginning. So we're not going to talk about Medabots Rokusho, not today anyway. Today, we're going to take a look at Medarot Kuwagata. And man, was that a long intro, and it's not going to get shorter from here, I'm afraid. So get comfy. So Medarot Kuwagata stars a young Hikaru Henry Agata. He, being a faithful pet owner, decides to take his energetic dog Bonaparte to the local park and play a game of catch with him, except that he flings a bone at some random passerby's head, causing them to flee and drop a bizarre coin. Now Hikaru, being the nice kid that he is, he decides to take it to the proper authorities, whose only response is, you can keep it. Good life lesson, guys. Well, it turns out that Hikaru's magical coin that he found was actually a medal, a key component to the newest fad, Medabots. Small, 3-foot-tall robots that are your best friends that you fight with because reasons. And it just so happens that on his way home, his father has just recently bought a brand new Medabot just for Hikaru, and conveniently enough, that Medabot happens to match both the version of the game you have, as well as the medal you just picked up, thus giving Hikaru his new best friend. Depending on which version that would be, it would either be Metal Beetle, which would later be known as Medabi, not to be confused with the one we in North America know about. No, that would be the 2.0 Medabi, which was orange instead of brown. Or if you have this version, Head Scissors, but he got nicknamed Rokusho. Again, not to be confused with the one we actually know, that would be Ikitenryo's Rokusho, which, if you think that's very confusing to keep in order, the people who made this game have trouble with that. Like seriously, in all the promotional material, they get them confused all the time, to the point where the only difference between them is one is spelled with katakana and the other hiragana. Did I mention I've played a lot of these games? I kinda played a lot of these games. Anyway, Hikaru with his new best friend Rokusho go become the world's greatest Medarotter. We're just gonna use the English terms because these Japanese portmanteaus are a little rough. So he's out to become the greatest meta fighter of all time and defeat the notorious Robo Gang, henceforth affectionately known as the Neoprene Home Fixin' Team, because obvious reasons. Anyway, the story itself is actually pretty simple for what it is, but what really impressed me is not necessarily the story itself, but the natural progression through the game. See, I can't read a lick of Japanese, and yet I managed to complete this game fully, only getting stuck once. And as far as I'm aware, there is no guides on this game at all. because this game is designed in a really simplistic, intuitive way. Basically, every chunk of the world map is a part of one large town because the entire world is one town for reasons, but every chunk of the map has multiple exits that will be blocked off. Once you complete a specific part in the story, one of those roadblocks will disappear, basically showing you exactly where you need to go. And that happens throughout the entire game. So even if you can't read a lick of Japanese like me, or even if you can't read at all, you can play through this just with a standard amount of exploration and inquisitiveness. Because the moment you see an open path you haven't gone through, you're going to want to explore it, and it's really going to just lead you to the next chunk of story. Very intuitive. Like I said, there was one exception though. As I have said, there was an opened path that I wanted to explore, and all it led to was like 2 houses. And this was a little bit confusing because nothing happened in those 2 houses. That's because you actually have to go into one of those houses and jump through their window to explore their backyard to continue. Happens nowhere else in the game, but other than that one moment, it is entirely playable without being able to read Japanese. At least in terms of advancing the plots. You might have some trouble with menus, but you'll figure it out with a little bit of experimentation. Now there is one thing about the story I don't like, and that is this game has multiple endings. Again, this is a Game Boy game, and again, this is like 97. Multiple endings hasn't really been done too often at this point, but yeah, this game has 3 endings, 2 of which are basically good endings, and 1 is a bad ending, which was ironically referenced in the anime. Huh. Now the thing is, both of these good endings have exclusive Medabots associated with them, so it is actually impossible to 100% a single cartridge of this game. And what's more is, you have to go through some arcane nonsense to get the good endings in this game. You have to answer specific questions from specific characters in a specific way, and if you do any of that wrong, you get a bad ending. And what's even better is there is a room very early on in the game that you'll be going by a couple of times over the course of the game. If you ever enter that, you automatically get the bad ending. And it's not like this room is labeled, not that I could read it or anything. It's not like there's any sort of thing that says, yo, don't go in here. It's just, you go in here, congratulations, bad ending. Awesome. Now, while the actual progression through story is very, very simplistic, the combat could be nothing further from that. Don't get me wrong, it's got its simplistic bits and you can actually get through it pretty simply, but it is wildly complex. And again, this is coming from someone who's actually played the English one of these games. I still don't know all of the intricacies of combat. So I'm going to try and simplify this about as much as I possibly can, just for the sake of making it as easy to understand as possible. And this part might jump around a little bit, so I apologize, but bear with me. Now, before we can actually talk about combat, we have to talk about what is probably the most important aspect of Medabots, which is your Medabot. A Medabot contains 3 core aspects, and each one of these has several intricacies within as well. Core aspect number 1 is the tin pet. This is your Medabot's skeleton. These are gendered, which ends up sort of dictating what sort of equipment you can put on it. And spoilers, female tin pets are really rare, their parts are even rarer. You're not going to get one until about halfway through the game, and they're pretty much all dialed up for supports and are pretty fragile. So yeah, they kind of got shafted a little bit in this game. If you want a really good female Medabot, get the sequel, which had a Valkyrie that kicked copious amounts of bottom. But either way, these are gendered and they sort of dictate what you can equip onto your Medabots. Next are your parts. These are the fun bits because they're your weapons. These dictate your combat abilities. Every Medabot equips 4 parts to become functional. First are the legs. Legs dictate your overall speed in combat as well as evasive abilities, and there are multiple different types of legs, such as bipedal legs, wheeled legs, or even flying legs. And each one of those actually interacts with the various different environments differently. Some receive bonuses depending on which terrain they're running on, whereas some penalties. See, we're only starting and things are already getting way too complicated. Okay, next are the arms. These are your main weapons. You have left arms and right arms, and no, you can't put a left arm on a right arm. It just doesn't work that way, Skippy. Now, these can be broken into several categories as well. To keep it simple, you've got melee weapons, you have ranged weapons, and you have support weapons. Melee weapons come in multiple flavors, but they are mostly swords and hammers. And these act differently than ranged weapons or support weapons. First and foremost, if you use a melee weapon, you are only able to attack the enemy that's nearest to you. And secondly, depending on which melee weapon, kind of changes the aspects of how you attack. If you use a sword, you're going to be faster to attack, as well as have a chance to dodge, but you're going to do less damage. If you use a hammer, you're slower to attack, you can't dodge anything coming your way, and it has a decent chance of missing, comparatively to a sword. However, if you damage an enemy's part enough with a hammer, you can destroy it and then do chain damage to more parts afterwards. Basically, the damage isn't limited to a single part when you use a hammer, but there's a lot of risks with it. And I hope this small chunk of looking at melee weapons kind of gives you an idea of how complex fighting can get, because I didn't use a lot of ranged weapons, but they function somewhat similarly, except that you aren't limited to attacking the enemy that is closest to you, and what enemy you attack and what specific part you attack seems to be dictated by both an aiming stat as well as your metal. We'll get to that. And then there's support abilities, which are mostly just for screwing your opponents over or just prolonging a fight, making it as frustrating as possible. Again, I didn't use too many of these, I was too busy smashing my opponent over the head with a sword or a hammer, but I did use knight parts and they made things wildly simple. The final part we need to talk about is the head, and this is important because it's a weapon, similarly to your arms. However, this has an ammo stat. Basically, you can only use your head part so many times. And that actually makes it sort of like a last-ditch weapon. Like, if both your arms are destroyed, you can still attack using your head. But it has one more core important value, and that is, this is what houses basically the guts to your Medabot. If your head is destroyed, your Medabot is taken out of commission instantly. And yes, this does mean that if your team leader's head is taken out instantly, it's game over. But that works both ways, so it's kind of cool. The final aspect we have to talk about the Medabot itself is the metal. This is the guts, brain, heart, and if the anime is to be believed, soul of your Medabot. But in video game terms, this dictates what abilities get an overall buff to your Medabot, as well as its starting values, levels, and individual values. And this is actually really cool because every metal has a speciality. For example, since we're playing the Kuwagata or stag beetle version, we have a stag beetle metal, and that stag beetle metal happens to upgrade the abilities of our stag beetle Medabot. Swords and hammers mostly. That's pretty cool. Whereas if we were to take the metal from the opposite version, rhinoceros beetle metal, well, it would upgrade mostly shooting parts and would do absolutely nothing for our Medabot. Now what's interesting is you can actively upgrade these metals through combat experience, as well as through an almost proto-Skyrim-esque level of using your abilities to just boost abilities. Basically, the more you use X attack, the more you gain affinity for it and individual levels for it, and that's really, really cool. And as you level your metal, it will actually sort of evolve and ultimately give you greater stat bonuses towards everything. Really wildly deep, and we haven't even really properly talked about combat. See how complicated this game is? And I'm trying to be succinct about it. Alright, once we actually have our Medabots set up, we have combat. Combat takes place on a field that is split into 9 horizontal rows. 3 on your side of the battlefield on the left side of the screen, 3 on the right. And these rows dictate your Medabots. You can have up to 9 Medabots in your team, but you can only have 3 in combat at most. Combat then basically requires your Medabots to run to the center, and once they hit the center, they can execute whatever attack you've commanded it to do. And likewise, depending on what you do, it might change how things play out. Like I said, melee will attack whatever's nearest, gunners will target something else. It just depends wildly on your individual parts. The most important column in this game is the top column. That is where your team leader is. Like I said a little while back, taking your team leader out will instantly end the battle. And yes, critical headshots from the start of the match can happen and end a match real quick. It's just a thing that happens. And finally, once a fight ends, the loser must forfeit 1 part used in their active team, and this is entirely random. And yes, the enemy will more often than not probably take your best stuff, and your one-of-a-kind stuff isn't off the table, so you're going to be saving a lot in this game. In fact, especially early on, save scumming is just kind of required, especially in this version. And that is because this game, it ain't exactly balanced properly. Like, in all regards. The different versions aren't properly balanced comparatively. The individual Medabots that you can have and your opponent can have aren't balanced properly. Encounters aren't really balanced properly, but I think it's important we talk about this. So let's roll it back to the version differences. Because this game, like Pokemon, which was released 1 year before, has 2 versions. It has this version, the Kuwagata or stag beetle version, or the Kabuto rhinoceros beetle version. Unlike Pokemon, this game actually has very few differences between versions. in that it has all of 2. First, your starting Medabot and Metal. This game comes with Rakusho, the white sword-wielding stag beetle, and the Kabuto version comes with Medabi, the brown gun-toting rhinoceros beetle. These don't exactly equate properly though. See, Metal Beetle has 3 weapons, has a gun on each hand, and his head happens to double as a rocket launcher, all of which get boosted by his rhinoceros beetle Metal. That's awesome. If you happen to get the stag beetle Rakusho like I did, you're basically screwed. And this will be a trend that follows every Medarot game that follows. See, Rakusho gets 2 weapons, a sword and a hammer, and his head parts are support parts. Now, this might not sound like the biggest deal, but the design of Rakusho is low armor, high evasion. The core idea is to attack your opponent and destroy whatever part they're going to attack you with before they get a chance to. Unfortunately, if the enemy does happen to attack you, you're probably going to lose a part instantaneously. And since you only have 2 attacking parts, this doesn't exactly leave you a lot of wiggle room. What's even more interesting, his head parts, which are stag beetle parts mind you, don't get a buff from his stag beetle metal. So you don't even get that bonus. So when you start, you're going to want to buy a physical attacking head like immediately, just as a pro tip. But the funny thing is, balance-wise, while starting out, the stag beetle is severely overwhelmed by any opponent, really. Once you have a teammate to help soak up the damage, he becomes significantly better than the rhinoceros beetle, just because he's so fast and does so much damage. It is impressive how weirdly balanced this is, even just between versions. Now, what makes things even more interesting balance-wise is when you encounter the first member of the Neoprene Home Fixin' team. She's equipped with some kind of shark Medabot, I believe, and you're fighting on the beach, which it has a massive advantage on. And this kind of talks about why fighting enemies isn't exactly balanced, because she can basically rush you. And I'm using a Medarot that has the fastest legs across both versions. Again, a theme that will continue with the later games. And I'm on par with them. They can take my legs out in 1 turn. If that happens, it will then proceed to attack me twice before I get to attack it ever again. At which point I will have lost both my arms, and I will have lost this fight. Like I said, save scumming is kind of a thing you're going to need to do a lot in this game, because this game does not like to balance its enemies properly. Another great example of that, random encounters aren't exactly balanced for where you are in the game. You can run into 2-on-1 fights before you get your second Medarot, or if you really mess up how you progress through this game, 3-on-1 fights, in which case you're completely done out of the box. Now the nice thing is you can run from fights, but that requires an expendable item that you can only carry so many of, so that's not exactly the best solution. And even once you get a full team of like 9 Medabots, sometimes you'll just run into enemies that have 1, and it is just a complete turkey shoot. Like, it is just embarrassingly grim fighting them. And going back to that member of the Neoprene Home Fixin' team, she happened to be guarding a cave, right? Well, in that cave happens to contain your second Medabot, as well as your second Metal. And this goes to the next of 2 differences that Medabots had. Metals. In this version, that cave happens to contain a Night Metal. The Night Metal happens to boost Night abilities, obviously enough, which don't happen to do any damage. This cave also contains random encounters that have Night parts. Now, Night parts are special because they do 0 damage, but they happen to have about 6 times as much health as any other part in the game, as well as have the ability to become a giant damage magnet. So if you, say, spent about 15-ish minutes just, grinding this area for a full set of Night parts and slap a Night Metal in there, hell, get the other version, don't use a Night Metal, the boost is just going to add insult to injury anyway. You've got a damage magnet as your number 2 who will never let your teammate ever get hurt. Congratulations, in the first cave, you have found the beat the game button. And what's even better, there's an equally rare Medarot in the exact same cave called Rollstar. If you're familiar with the English dub, I think he was called Stingray. He's a high-powered, laser-toting badass that might miss a lot, but when he hits you, he's gonna melt all your armor off instantaneously. And again, your second Medarot isn't gonna let anyone on your team ever get hurt. You might notice that I haven't changed my team across the entire playthrough. I didn't need to. Out of the starting gate, I had an invincible team once I got my second Medabot. That's just how this game is balanced. It is bizarre. So yeah, combat. It's It's actually a lot of fun, and it's wildly addicting and ridiculously deep, but at the same time, you can also get through it by just spamming hammers on everything, and usually you'll win, you know, provided you're not within like the first 5 minutes of the game when it's really just save scumming. There's one other problem I have with combat, and it's a bit of a compound problem that exists in varying degrees across the series. You don't have any way to tell how much your opponent you have actually damaged. Like, you can see their generalized health bar, which is an amalgam of all their armor, but you can't see how much each individual part has been damaged. Now, it might say in Japanese exactly like what part was hit and for how much damage, but there's no visual indicator, which makes it a little bit trickier to formulate a strategy if you can't read it. And while this specific problem is remedied in later iterations of this series, another part of it that sort of compounds it here is the fact that you don't really have any control over what parts you're attacking. So combine that with not being able to see how much individual health each opponent's parts have, as well as, on the flip side, how much damage your individual parts have, it's really hard to create a cohesive strategy just based around deciding whether or not you can roll the dice on using one specific part, or maybe it will get destroyed by the next attack, so don't do that, and what you can focus on your opponent. And I think what you target is dictated by luck, your metal, and a bit of an accuracy stat, but it feels entirely random. I don't think it is, but it feels that way, and that does take away a little bit of the fun of combat, unfortunately. Another interesting thing about this game is there's not really a money system. Don't get me wrong, there's money in this game, but you don't earn money from defeating foes. Instead, you just get their parts, which you then have to turn into money by selling back to the stores. Small thing, but I thought it was pretty interesting. Overall, Medarot, or Medabots, is a wildly complex game, considering this is just a simple Game Boy game that has just wildly intricate combat that even after spending hours playing, I still don't fully understand. And it's not because of any of the dialogue or any sort of language barrier, it's just really freaking deep. And it's fun. And yeah, while it's not really terribly balanced early on, and there's a lot of exploits, it's fun to discover those too. Sure, it's not the most balanced experience, but combat-wise, Medabots is damn fun. Now, the overall presentation to Medabots, Kuwagata, Rokusho, whatever you want to call this thing, it's a little bit rough. Visually, I kind of like how simple the overworld and non-combat stuff is, and I love how it's contrasted by how visually detailed the combat is. Like, seriously, the animation might not be all that great in combat, but the overall detail in the Medabots themselves is really impressive. The fact that there's different visual changes to the environments to reflect the changes of the terrain, that's amazing, and the fact that that has gameplay repercussions is also pretty mind-blowing. I guess if I had any complaints about the visual design in combat, it would be that the actual sprites for the Medabots themselves on the battlefield are kind of generic. There's like 3 total, a bird, a car, and a soldier guy, just depending on your leg types. But they wouldn't actually make personalized sprites for your Medabots until like the Game Boy Advance, so somewhere along the lines I kind of have to give them a pass, at least this early on. But this game does kind of suffer from Pokemon Gen 1 syndrome, in that if you look at what we understand as Medabots today, these are just going to look weird and wrong. Not bad, mind you, just weird and wrong. Audio-wise, it's okay, but it's severely lacking. There's like one overworld theme, one combat theme, and like one menu theme, and they will drive you up the wall. They might not sound bad, but they are going to get very, very monotonous very quickly, and that's why I mostly played this game on silent this time. Overall, the presentation is mostly going to be a your mileage will vary sort of thing. If you can put yourself in the shoes of someone from the past who hasn't seen Medabots, then it'll probably look okay. And it might sound, well, it's going to drive you up the wall, just how little different music there is in this game, but if nothing else, it'll look okay. Now, if you want a copy of Medarot's Kuwagata version, or Medabots for Kusho, however you want to call it, or really any Medabots game, barring 3, it's not going to cost too much. Cheapest one I'm seeing is 99 cents plus shipping. And that's the thing, if you look up import Game Boy games, or really just import games from Japan, chances are, if you're sorting by cheapest first, you're going to find a lot of Medabot games. They are wildly inexpensive. Now, like I said, there were 3 exceptions to that, those 3 being Medabots for Kusho, you know, the English one, Medabots 5, like the English one, it was probably one of my favorites, and Shingata Medarot, which is a bit of an oddity, all of which cost a lot of money. Even the English one in Japanese is wildly expensive. But the nice thing is, pretty much all other Medabot games are dirt cheap. This game also got not one, but 2 expansions in Medarot Parts Collection and Medarot Parts Collection 2, not to be confused with Medarot 2 Parts Collection. Yes, they really could have named those better, but that were basically excuses to give you extra fights that gave you full sets of new parts. They're not really all that important, but, you know, they're nice little expansions if you want to hook up your Game Boy to them, I guess. This game also got a remake on the Wonder Swan, which actually used an improved visual design that would actually give you the Medabots we know and love today. And I can't comment on that one because I've never even seen a Wonder Swan. There's also the aforementioned Shingata Medarot, Medabots True Type, which was kind of a remake of this on the Game Boy Advance, except that they changed all the characters' names and gave it an art style that basically no one liked. Seriously, this is supposed to be Rakusho. What the hell is this? Oh, and they removed the night parts, because the developers just knew they were too powerful. And god damn it, they were glorious. But either way, Medarot's Kuwagata is not only a connection to an anime that I quite liked when I was a kid, but also has a special place in my heart for being the first import RPG I managed to get through entirely on my own, even without being able to read the dialogue. And I mean, if what I've said at this point isn't enough of an indication that I love these games, this game made me want to buy all the rest. In fact, I've tried to collect almost every Kuwagata version that can be played region-free, and at this point, I'm only missing 2. But that's mostly Nintendo's fault for releasing half the series on the 3DS, which was a step back and region-locked. Not that I'm bitter at all about that. Yeah, it's unbalanced all over the place, and yeah, it's really awkward with how much you have to save scum, especially early on with its high encounter rate. But man, is it fun. It's wildly inexpensive, and if you have an interest in trying to import RPGs, even if you can't read Japanese, I'd say this is a great starter. And I mean, it's like $1, and there's another version of it, so you could get it twice for basically nothing. And it's part of an awesome series that is, by and large, equally easy to get into without having to read Japanese, with maybe the exception of Medarot Navi. That one added some strategy game elements that made it a little bit harder to pick up. But by and large, these are easy and great to play games, and I cannot wait to review another one in this series because, damn it, I love these games. Because Medarot is an absolute blast. It's beetle robots beating the ever-living stuffing out of each other, and that's just freaking awesome.